Okay, here's a bit of feedback on the library essay. What used to be the library before COVID-19, the OneNote essay. So the essay was, you've got it in front of you, it's the one called First Essay. So it says, explaining, using an ADAS diagram, how quantitative easing should lead to an increase in both economic growth and inflation. So really there's two aspects to this essay. One is you've really got to demonstrate a good understanding of QE, and then two, you've got to demonstrate clearly how that leads to economic growth and inflation. So how does QE work? So what are the key elements that you've got to have in this essay? You've got to show that you know that QE involves a central bank. So it's not the government per se, it's the central bank. And what it does is it creates new money. It creates that electronically. So it creates new money electronically. Yeah, and what it does is it uses that to buy financial assets. Yeah, so it buys bonds, usually, from financial markets. And what you've got to be able to do is to show you understand what the effects of bond purchases are. Yeah? So obviously the first thing that happens is that there's an increase in the price of those bonds. So what that means is that other bondholders, because bond prices are higher, other bondholders, they now have an increase in their wealth overall. Yeah, and that can immediately feed through to an increase in aggregate demand, partly because obviously they're wealthier, but also it can lead to higher levels of confidence. Secondly, because bond prices increase, what it does is it leads to a decrease in bond yields. So the point about bonds, is that they pay a fixed amount of money each year. If the price of that bond is higher, then the percentage return is lower. So if you have something that pays you £10 a year, and you pay, say, you pay £200 for that, then your yield is 5%. If the same thing that gives you £10 a year costs you 50 quid, then your yield is 20%. So an increase in bond prices leads to a decrease in bond yields. And what that means is that people will then go and buy other assets. So they'll go and put their money into houses, into shares, which increases the price of those assets. So that's number two. So increase in bond yields therefore leads to an decrease in bond yields leads to an increase in the price of other assets. And finally, the obvious thing is there's just increased liquidity in the banking system. So there's more cash in circulation. That's going to make its way into banks, who can then lend it. And what that might do is it might decrease interest rates. Although that's not the key. Interest rate falling may not be relevant because we may be in some sort of a liquidity trap. The key is that there's simply more money available to lend. So there's wealth effects. There are lower interest rate effects, greater liquidity effects. All of those things contribute together to increase aggregate demand. So if I was writing this essay, my first section would then be simply that, explaining how QE works, feeding through to the point at which we then have an increase in aggregate demand. The question asks you for a diagram. I'd simply use a standard Keynesian one. Longer aggregates fly like that. AD1. We then said that AD2, AD increases. That creates growth. So you've got to explain that there's an increase in aggregate demand, leads to multiplier effects and that type of stuff. So we can talk about how, what you've got to do is not just say GDP goes from Y1 to Y2, but explain the process through which there's a knock-on effect. There's more demand, more jobs, they go out and spend, therefore that leads to more jobs and so on. And at the same time, inflation is pushed up. And again, you want to say, why is that? So as demand rises, that means that businesses are in a stronger position, with respect to consumers. They can, they've got more customers, so they can afford to increase prices. But also, rising demand means the economy is doing well. Workers may be asking for pay rises, so therefore the firm may have to increase prices. And really, it's as simple as that. And what it boils down to is, do you really understand QE? If the answer is yes, this part is really simple. In the exam, what tended to happen is everybody just went, QE increases aggregate demand, and did this bit where you're not going to get more than about 4 out of 10 for that, because you've really got to demonstrate that strong understanding of QE. If you're not sure, then ask me to make a full QE video, and I will. Part B was asking you, whether, evaluate the view that deflation is always undesirable for an economy. And I think the best way of approaching that is to say, well, look, it depends, on the type of deflation. So we can have deflation for one of two reasons. If we use the neoclassical short run diagram, it's easier to show that. On the one hand, what we might have is we could have a reduction in aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. That leads to deflation and falling GDP. On the other hand, you might get so that's normally linked to recession, and what we got there is demand deflation. On the other hand, it's possible, that what you get is technological improvements. So this is kind of, internet, productivity, innovation. What you get is you get deflation with rising GDP. And you got supply side deflation, and that's a really good way to start the essay. It's just say, well, look, actually, much depends. This looks pretty harmless, supply side deflation, because we're all getting cheaper products. You can bring out some of the benefits of deflation, which is leading to a decrease in price for consumers. So they're happy. It may lead to an increase in exports, so that's good news. And it's associated, because productivity and efficiency is increasing, it's actually associated with an increase in GDP, not a decrease. So that's brilliant. So that type of deflation, arguably, it is good news. Except that there is a risk, that what it does is it starts to create deflationary expectations. In other words, people start to expect prices always to fall, and when they expect prices to fall, they then may defer purchases. They may stop buying things. So that would be my first bit. So, well, look, it can be good, but there is a risk it leads to deflationary expectations. If we get deflationary expectations, what that could do is lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, which could then turn nice deflation into bad deflation. So what we might now get, is falling aggregate demand, and falling aggregate demand and falling prices all at the same time. That creates a number of issues. So demand deflation is unfortunate, because what it means is, one, businesses, what's happening is that they're facing a big decrease in their revenue. So their revenue is being squeezed. The money in for those businesses is getting reduced. Therefore, they need to decrease costs. And the easy way of doing that is to decrease the number of employees you've got. And at that stage, you can see that you're potentially trapped in a deflationary spiral. Because if we decrease employees, that means that we decrease consumption. They're not going to spend, but that then feeds back into a reduction in aggregate demand. Businesses also faced with revenue, they're likely not to invest either. So clearly, we've got a problem here. On the household side, they're in difficulty too. A decrease, deflation, what it tends to do is it leads to an increase in the real value of debt. So inflation wipes out debt. If you borrow 100,000 quid, and then there's loads of inflation, then you can pay it back quite easily 10, 15 years from now. If there's deflation, the reverse is true. So households are really worried about debt. And what they're going to try and do, therefore, is they're going to try and pay off their debt. But what that means is that they're going to decrease consumption. At the same time, they're worried about their jobs. So again, consumption falls. And therefore, your danger is you get trapped into this deflationary spiral that's almost impossible to stop. Or it gains momentum. And the final bit of my essay then, that's probably enough, but my final bit of the essay would then say, and furthermore, deflation, once it's established, it's hard to stop. And the reason it's hard to stop is, one, fiscal issues. What we've said is that deflation leads to an increase in the real value of debt. So governments aren't going to want to borrow. They're not going to want to increase debt. Because they're worried about the size of that debt growing. And secondly, what deflation also does is it leads to an increase in real interest rates. If interest rates are 3%, suppose that's interest rates. Suppose interest rates are 3% and inflation is 2%, then your real interest rate is actually 1%. You put money in the bank and earn 3%. Inflation is 2%, so that kind of prices go up by 2%, so you're only 1% better off. But imagine interest rates are 3% and inflation is minus 2%. Well, actually, you put money in the bank and get 3%, and prices are 2% lower when you come out. Bloody good news, real interest rate is 5%. And the problem is that governments can only really cut interest rates basically to zero. So if you cut interest rate to zero and inflation is still minus 3%, your real interest rate is still plus 3%. Yeah, and therefore you run out of power to do anything about this. Yeah, so monetary policy becomes ineffective. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload this to YouTube, but you'll have found that out already. I'll put the mark scheme alongside it, and I'll also put some notes on both QE and deflation, for anybody who's interested. If you're unsure, then feel free just to send me a message about all this. I hope that's helpful. I'll put something different on OneNote next week, and we can just kind of build up a momentum. I know that was a bit fast, but I didn't want to take too long. Otherwise, I know you're not going to want to watch them. So if you do want more detail, just send me a message.